Chapter 5, Carbohydrates Screencast 2. Now let's take a step back, and the first screencast for Chapter 5 was overall an introduction to carbohydrates. Now this screencast is going to focus on recommended intake and some general characteristics and recommendations about the intake of carbohydrates. Now, the RDA is 130 grams per day, and this is something that you should be comfortable with. You may be asked to calculate, given a meal, the percentage of RDA that's actually found in a particular food item or so on. Now, it's 130 grams per day. It supplies the glucose that's necessary for function of the brain and the rest of the central nervous system. So I want us to keep in mind something here. Glucose is the only thing that the central nervous system can use for energy. So it's not capable of utilizing any other energy resources that the body is capable of utilizing. Now, the other thing that this 130 grams per day allows for is preventing the partial replacement of glucose by ketone bodies. Now, we're going to talk a little bit later about that. Another thing that's important about making sure that there's an adequate intake of glucose is that of carbohydrate is you're not going to use other substrates to provide the energy, specifically protein. And remember, when we look at the job associated with carbohydrate overall, it's an energy-yielding substrate, and it's what the body uses primarily for energy sources. Now, the Food and Nutrition Board recommends an intake of 45 to 65% of total energy intake. This is the AMDR, so that is the other value you need to be comfortable with. So that value. Now, when we're looking at the types of carbohydrates that we should be consuming, the emphasis should be on fiber-rich fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. We really need to decrease or limit the consumption of added sugars and caloric sweeteners. So notice it's caloric sweeteners, those sweeteners that actually are nutritive and have energy associated with them. Now, when we look at the typical North American diet, we're obtaining about 50% of energy from carbohydrates. Now, this is something that you'll get a readout in as part of your diet analysis. Now, when we look at the types of carbohydrates that Americans are consuming, that's where the problem is. There's nothing wrong with 50%. That falls within the AMDR of 45 to 65%. But let's take a look at where we primarily are getting these carbohydrates. So white breads, soft drinks, cookies, cakes, sugars, donuts, syrups, jams, and potatoes. Other than potatoes, most of these are empty calories. So that's a really important difference that we have to keep in mind. They're highly processed and not the best source of carbohydrates. Now, when we look at some dietary guidelines for Americans, we should actually be limiting added sugars to no more than 10% of daily total energy intake. Now, take a step back, and actually in Chapter 2, we looked at some updates to the food label. And one of the most significant updates on that food label is that they now have to include added sugars in the food item. So that's a lot of really good information to help you understand whether or not you're meeting this particular guideline. When we look at the World Health Organization, they also kind of fall under this, where added sugar should provide no more than 10% of total energy intake. Now, if we're looking at some other, and you'll see that there's a whole bunch of different organizations that have different limits. I don't really want you to memorize these, but just to understand that there is basically different recommendations from different organizations. So the Institute of Medicine's Food and Nutrition Board, they're indicating the upper limit of 25% of energy intake from added calories. I feel that the 10% is a much better goal to shoot for. When we look at the American Heart Association, the upper limit of sugar intake should be half of one's discretionary calorie allowance. And this is based on the relationship between sugar intake and the increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Not that sugar itself is associated with an increased risk, but the weight gain because of the empty calories associated with sugar. Now, the adequate intake for fiber, and this is another value you should be comfortable with, is about 14 grams per 1,000 kcals. Before age 50, it's 25 grams for women, 38 grams for men. After age 50, we're looking at 21 grams per day for women and 30 grams per day for men. And when we look at the adequate intake, it's aimed to reduce the risk of two diseases in particular, diverticular disease and cardiovascular disease. Here, this is just a general table that's giving you an idea of various amounts of fiber. There's general plans for getting 25 grams of fiber per day, and another where you're going to be getting 38 grams of fiber per day. And I really do recommend taking a look at this. Not that you need to follow it, but it gives you a good idea of certain foods that are high in fiber and worth trying. Now, another thing that's important is you don't all of a sudden want to crank up the amount of fiber in your diet. This is something that you should increase slowly. All of a sudden, if you were to increase fiber significantly, because you're stressing, you're adding something new to your GI tract, it's going to adjust to that. And one of the adjustments that you'll probably encounter is there's going to be an increase in the production of gas and potentially intestinal cramping, because remember, that's how it's broken down. Okay, we don't have the enzymes to break down fiber, so it's basically due through bacterial fermentation within the large intestine. Now here, this is giving us an overall pie chart of our carbohydrate intake, and as noted, carbohydrates account for 50% of the energy intake in the US. Now, the issue here is the types of carbohydrates consumed do not meet recommendations. If we look at added sugars, accounting for approximately 14.5%, and this is made up of sugar-sweetened beverages and caloric sweeteners, we'll also see that the fiber intake is significantly less than recommended, and this is generally due to two things: the low intake of fruits and vegetables and a high consumption of refined grains. So if we kind of look at where our carbohydrates are coming from, a big chunk from soda, energy drinks, sport drinks, fruit drinks, tea and coffee, bread and other grains, okay, candy, sweets, and snacks. So we're really just not choosing or making the right choices where we should be getting our carbohydrates from. Now, this particular table is kind of giving us an idea of different things that we should do. Reading the ingredient labels, especially looking at the added sugars, okay, and really trying to select items that are lower in total sugar when that's possible. Focusing much more on fresh fruits or fruits packaged in water, juice, or light syrup rather than heavy syrup, and buying fewer foods that are high in sugar, such as baked good, candies, etc. Okay, so these are some really important recommendations. In the kitchen, reduce the sugar in food prepared at home. Try a new low sugar recipe or adjust to your own. You can actually use some of the other food sweeteners that are actually heat stable. Okay, use spices. Try other things than sugar to add flavor and texture to food, and also using home prepared items with less sugar instead of commercially prepared products that are typically much higher in sugar overall. Now, at the table, you want to reduce the use of sugars overall, choose fewer foods high in sugar, okay? Reach for fresh fruit instead of cookies or other types of snacks that you might have a habit to reach for. Add less sugar to food, so those are things that we typically might add sugar to, such as coffee, tea, cereal, and other types of things that you might eat. And overall, probably the biggest recommendation here is put an emphasis on the number of sugared soft drinks, punches, and fruit juices. That's a really important factor. I've had a number of friends who just eliminated soft drinks or things like that from their diet, And that alone was enough of a behavior that resulted in significant weight loss. And the thing we want to remember here is those are all empty calories. Okay? And the typical American is what we refer to as a positive energy balance. And we have more energy being consumed than expended through activity. And that results in storage or weight gain. Now, one thing you want to be on the lookout for is these stamps that account for whole grain. Okay? And so some of these will indicate 20 grams or more per serving. And then if we look at 100% whole grain, you're actually getting 18 grams or more per serving. So it's really important to kind of look at these because they are a very, very good source of whole grain. And that is going to be a really good source of fiber overall. Now, what I want to kind of point out here is look at what the recommended range is for fiber. And we are not alone. Okay? If you look at the other countries that are listed here, we are on the low side for sure. Okay, if we kind of take a look at that, we're the second lowest. Okay, getting the second lowest amount of fiber as a country, but it's a problem worldwide. All these other countries, their recommended range is not being met. So I want us to kind of remember that this is just not a problem in the United States. This is a problem worldwide, and people across the board are not getting the fiber that they should be.